Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. Can you guys believe we're in the middle of October almost? What in the world? So we need to start setting up appointments. I know I've been doing some, continue to set appointments for business planning. Miss Linda, business planning. Bobby, we're doing it today, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Pippa, business planning.
Yep.
Yep. So we need to do some of that.
Yep.
So we got to start that or continue that because we've got lots of business planning to do because it's October. I can't even believe it. Has everybody been able to access the business planning online? If you haven't, it's under My Hub, under resources, and it is the top of it, 2024 business planning. But don't worry, we can always go through it. Just do me a favor, if you know how to print out your production from the last, I want to see what you've done year to date and then the same time period last year, because we're going to look at the difference and we want to look at where, oh my gosh, who is that? Barbara Ashley Jones, you're making me a little dizzy there. Oh my gosh, guys, I know this is totally off topic, but I want to tell you guys, we did a test drive on a Tesla yesterday. Anybody do that? Oh, I thought it was going to bomb. Oh, it's horrible.
Really?
Oh my gosh, that pedal thing. Oh, they have this thing where it's regenerative braking. Listen, I like roller coasters, but this is horrible. I'm not going to get technical saying that. Okay. So anyway, no, I wish that was it. No, my Audi does that. No, this is you don't get to coast. As soon as you take your foot off the pedal, it slows you down to stop. It's horrifying. You go. Yeah, no, it's awful. No, no bueno. No bueno. My husband and I were like, we don't feel very well. No Tesla owners here. I was like, he's like, do you like the Model Y? I said, no, I like the X. And now I don't like any. Don't like them all. No good. So anyway, okay, back on to what we came here for, which is called the ins and outs of addendas. So let's hop on over to share my screen. And let me admit all first. Hold on. Okay. And I'm actually going to put in the participants so that I can keep admitting people. All right. All right, there we go. And I'll put in my wonderful little team. All right, guys. So anybody who's on Zoom, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions as we go. Because there's some really crucial things I want to talk about addendas. A lot of things that people don't realize. First thing I want to talk about are these little reserve spots. It's really funny, but a lot of people don't know what they are. Does everybody here know what those reserve spots are for on the as-is contract? I know.
Only because I was in your class last week.
Yeah. So what these little reserve spots are for is if you are actually in the residential contract. Now, remember, guys, both of our contracts we're looking at are created by the Florida Bar Association. The CRISP has completely different addendas, but they are all in the dot loop, which we're going to look at. So we're all going to, but what we're talking about today are only the Florida Bar Association addendas, because that's what we use is the Florida Bar. Okay. So okay, Chad is joining. So there we go. So you'll notice that if we went and looked at, for example, this is the residential contract and this is the as-is residential. If we looked at defective drywall and we looked here, defective drywall, they're both on M. It's the same one. If we looked at, for example, the kickout clause on X and we looked at it on the as-is, the kickout clause is on X. They're exactly the same. These contracts, other than the as-is versus the FAR bar difference, which is really what, guys? It's the inspection, right? That is the difference, the inspection and the permits. These things are the biggest difference, which I'm talking about on Thursday, the differences between the as-is and FAR bar. That's where these contracts differ, okay? But everything else in these contracts are exactly the same, including the addendas, except for, as you see here in the as-is version, you have reserved in the I, reserved in the K, reserved in the L. So if you go into the residential, I don't know why you have mold inspection for I there, but the K, the as-is, and the right to inspect, right to cancel. The reason you have those in the residential is because the difference between the two is the as-is and the right to inspect. That's the difference between the two contracts, right? So what they're doing is they're saying they're adding these two addendas to the residential contract to try to make them, for the buyer, the same as the as-is contract, but it's making for the seller the higher standards of the residential contract. So you never, ever want to make the residential contract an as-is contract for the buyer, for your seller. So we're going to start by looking at that, okay? Does anybody have any questions on what I said about that? So let's look at Florida interactive forms. When you want to find an addenda, we want to look at what it was called and just start to type it. As is. So notice you've got as is residential contract, as is writer, FAR bar, as is with right to inspect. Now that says crisp. Notice this, crisp, see how it says CRSP? That is never going to match any of our contracts. There's going to be 2 addendas for everything except for FERPTA. FERPTA is the only one that we can use, which is a crisp addenda, which is retarded, but that is, we don't care what it is. We have to use that FERPTA addenda with our contract because it is an acknowledgement that it is a FERPTA sale. Does everybody know what FERPTA sale is? Does anybody not know what a FERPTA sale is? Speak now or forever hold your peace. I think I have a chat and I don't know who it is. Hi, I am, I said, oh, hi. How are you? Taking notes. Terrific. Well, happy to have you. If you need any help, let us know. Okay, great. So here you go. FERPTA, remember, is a foreign seller. So a buyer needs to acknowledge that they understand the seller's foreign, that they will work and comply with the rules and guidelines of the IRS. And they plan to do whatever the IRS needs for the withholding of the 15%. That is the only addenda that we want the buyer to sign. Are we all right with that? But that is the only addenda that they do not have for the FAR bar. But everything else, there's a crisp and there's a FAR bar. You see that? We're going to look at the as-is rider. This rider, let's take a peek at what it says. Basically, they're saying that the seller's obligation, they still have, they have to maintain the repair limits that they put into the contract. They're not relieving the seller's disclosure obligations. They're not relieving the seller their need to continue with keeping the property in warranty. They're basically saying the buyer is waiving any claims against the seller, but the seller has to continue doing all the things that they said they would do. The buyer now shall have, if left blank, 15 days with which to have the inspections done they want to. And if they decide not to close, the buyer has to repair any things that they would. But here it is, see. This is the language that we never want to add to a residential contract. If buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable to buyer, buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice. Why in the heck would we want to add that? That is a cancel for any reason clause. You guys see that? The whole reason of using the FAR bar is to not give the buyer that right. So you never want to allow this as-is contract, this as-is rider, if you are representing the seller and you have a residential contract, you never allow this as-is rider. You guys understand that? Everybody clear on that? Now, everyone, let's also look at the right to inspect, because the truth is it's the same thing. Now, let's take a look. How funny. We have a right to inspect crisp and a right to inspect FAR bar. Again, 2 addendas because we have 2 separate types of contracts, right? Where are they using the crisp again? Anybody remember? The Panhandle. Not who pretty much uses. Keep coming in and out. There he goes. Okay, so this is essentially the same thing as the as-is. I don't know why they decided to make 2. If you could slip it in another way, I'm not really sure. I like to call both of these addendums for the buyer, have your cake and eat it too. Okay. In lieu of the inspection period, buyer shall have, if left blank, 15 days with which to have the inspections that they desire. Again, they can have whatever they want during this right to inspect period. Isn't that nice? If the contract is terminated, they have to fix it. We already know that. Again, here's number 3 instead of C. If buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable to buyer, buyer may terminate the contract and then they get their money back. Look at that. Why would we want to add that to a residential contract? We wouldn't. That is the exact reason we're using the residential contract. We don't want to give the buyer the cancel for any reason clause. Now, if you're a buyer, well, why not? This is to have your cake and eat it too. You come in on a residential and That's a beautiful thing. But if you're a seller, no way. Any questions on that, guys? It's very important because if we're talking about the difference of these contracts, we'll go more into that on Thursday. And let's say you say to your seller, which one would you prefer? They pick the residential contract. Then you take in an offer and they have the right to inspect or they have the as-is addenda. You've just negated all of the beauty for your seller. Now you've obligated your seller for more things and you've given an out to the buyer. It's the worst of all things. You follow me? Because now the seller has agreed to a certain amount of money they're willing to do. At least in an as-is, they can say, I'm not doing anything, pound sand. So you've taken away. Now you've guaranteed that they're going to pay a certain amount, but the buyer can still cancel for any reason. What good is that for the seller? Does that make sense? Does anybody have a question on that? Because it's very important you understand that. Okay. We're going to go back to other addendas. The condominium rider, guys, this is so important you understand this. If you are writing any condos, if you sell any condos, you must have a condominium rider. It is right here, condominium rider. Now, see, there it is, FAR bar. This condominium rider usually has to be filled out by the seller who gives it to the association. They don't even know, because if you look at the condominium, first of all, it's asking, does the condominium association require approval, right? Sometimes an association requires that they approve the buyer, right? So this is important that we understand this. And if they're approved by the association, how long does it take them to be approved? And how long do they have to make the application to that association? Is there a question? Okay. Now, if they do not have right of first refusal, or if they do, this is important. You have to understand that. Now, do the members of the association have right of first refusal? This is like huge, guys. In certain instances, the members of the association can say whether or not they can purchase or not. This is
Meaning like your neighbors?
Yeah, the members of the association. Then the buyer shall, within blank days of the effective date, deliver all documents required as a condition precedent of the to be able to submit this process to the association and the members. Because if they have to submit an application, what is going along with that application? They have to do this within a certain period of time, right? Now, fees and assessment. This is really important because this can blow up any deal. We have not just your monthly assessments, right? There's monthly assessments. Sometimes you have, for example, let's talk about Baldwin Park. You have condo association. You have also a homeowners association. So if that's the case, you need a homeowners association addenda that goes along with the condo rider. Because you have the condo association, then you're going to have a homeowners association because you belong to the greater association of Baldwin Park. So you have two different things here. And then what if it's a CDD? Oh, it is in Baldwin Park. Then you need a CDD document that goes along with it because that goes with your taxes. So you see, that's three separate documents that you would need. You would not write it all here. Okay, sometimes people put it in the wrong place. It's not all about the condo. It's three separate things. Yeah, you pay it all because you're buying the condo, but it does not all belong here. Does that make sense? Okay, also, there are three different fees that you have to understand too. When you buy a condo, sometimes you have fees that they make you pay when you first buy a condo. And those fees would be, God, I can't think of the name of it.
Transfer fees.
Well, sometimes they call them transfer fees, capital contribution. That is super important. Lauria Park's capital contribution is high. Do you remember what it is in Lauria Park? Lauria Park, I think it's higher than $2,000. It's really high. It's ridiculous. So if you don't tell the buyer that there's a capital contribution, it's at least $2,500. I think it's even higher than that. And by the way, the seller has to pay coming and going. So if you don't tell the seller that and they get to closing, they're like, what the heck is this fee? Your deal could blow up. So you need to be aware of all these fees, and this has to get filled out. See, no one's going to know this stuff. You have to get it filled out by the association. And that's why when someone's like, well, they didn't live there, they don't know. You can't wash this away. Even if it's a cash deal, this has to be filled out. You can't just say, oh, I don't know. They never lived there, so I'm not responsible. You are responsible because there will be no closing if this is not filled out. Does that make sense? Because I see that a lot of times. They'll be like, oh, well, they don't know because they didn't live there.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? It happens all the time. We don't care. We need to know this information. And it is the seller's responsibility to provide it. So you can make sure that when you're submitting an offer as the buy side, buyer and seller agree, condominium rider, all condominium documents. We can get a list of everything that needs to be done, will be provided to the buyer within a certain amount of days. You know, that is going to be can be written into your contract under additional terms so that the buyer can get out if they don't provide it. Yeah, we need to be doing that because so many of these people say, oh, well, they didn't know, they didn't live there. I don't care. You're not going to be able to close this condo and you're going to be stuck and the buyer could lose their deposit while you're sitting around waiting because the listing agent is lazy and trying to say, well, it's not on us.
Yeah.
Yes, it is on you. So I just want you to be really aware of this. I've seen a lot of this more lately than ever. I mean, not like listing agents have been lazy before. It's just a surprise, right? No, they've been lazy all the time. That was a joke. But I just want you to know, this is a true thing. So this is a big thing. Then it talks about annual assessments. Another big thing, guys, special assessments. It asks here, is the seller represent that they're aware or not aware of any special assessments? Oftentimes, the seller has been given a letter. They have been alerted of a special assessment and they don't say anything. They're like, well, I didn't know, I didn't live there. That doesn't matter. If they've been given notice, they can be sued later because that notice went to their domicile. That is given notice. So you need to make sure if there is something that has been out there as a special assessment that they know is pending, they need, even if it's a cash deal, because this is a very big thing that has been going on. A lot of condominium fees have been going up a lot, especially if they're a little older. And this could be a really big reason for a lawsuit. So you just got to make sure that the seller finds this stuff out. He has to call. I don't care if he doesn't live there. That seller has to get involved. You can call all you want. They're probably not going to talk to you. That's the problem. Because the only person who's a member of that association is the seller. Even if they don't want to get involved, even if they never lived there, it doesn't matter. When they bought there, they became a member of the association. So therefore, they have a right to the information provided by that association. Now, a lot of these places have it online anyway. And that's even worse because if it's been provided online to you and then they're like, oh, I didn't know. That's even worse because now is even more accessible. Doesn't mean you can get to it because they need to have a login, they had to have a password, but just them saying, well, I didn't know, I didn't live there, does not excuse them from disclosure, just so you're aware. There's a lot more lawsuits about this stuff, I will tell you that. Okay, so here's this about a special assessments being levied or pending. This is important that they talk about. This is all about special assessments. And this is about pending litigation. That's another thing, especially as we're talking about older buildings that need repair. There's sometimes pending litigation because they've needed to repair because now we knew that there's something wrong with structural inside or something like that. That may be pending litigation. And the seller can't say, well, I didn't know because I didn't live there. He should have known because he had access to the information. It was given to him. So you've got to be very careful. So if you are representing that seller, make sure that they are talking to the condominium association, getting that information. If there's any kind of special assessments, current or pending, and if there's any litigation, current or pending. These things are huge. And just because you can't just say, I didn't know, and not furnish this information.
So the seller has to go and find out if there's any.
Yeah. And if you have a lazy seller, this may be a deal you don't want to take because you have to provide it because you could get wrapped into that lawsuit too.
Right.
Because you're representing them. It's bad. So then here, this is important. The buyer hereby acknowledges that the buyer has been provided a current copy of the declaration of condominium. These are all the things they have to get. Articles of incorporation, bylaws, rules of the association, a copy of the most recent year-end financials, and the frequently asked questions and answers document. Then 3 days excluding Saturday, Sundays, and legal holidays prior to the execution of this contract. Because what do they have? They have a 3-day right of rescission. So by checking this, this starts that 3-day right of rescission. When they sign it, now they have a 3-day right of rescission that starts. If they say, this agreement is voidable by buyer delivering written notice that the buyer's intention to cancel within 3 days, excluding Saturdays, Sundays, and legal holidays, right? After the date of the execution of this agreement by the buyer and receipt of the buyer, a current copy of all those things. So what does this say? If you check this, you better have gotten all those documents. Do not let your buyer check that if they haven't. But if you have uploaded all those documents, you're providing them, aren't you? And I would suggest when you are, yes, they should be up there. I would have them up there in supplemental information. And then when you're sending back the offer, make sure you're sending them back over. And I would be checking that box when you're sending over that condominium rider, because you are delivering it to them. Because that way you're starting that 3-day right of rescission. Because if not, guess what happens? That box doesn't get checked. And now the 3-day right of rescission doesn't get started. And they can start that 3-day right of rescission at any time they want to. It could be the closing day and they're like, oh, I never got all those documents. My 3-day right of rescission is starting. You know what? I don't feel comfortable with the bylaws. I think I'm going to cancel. And you're out of luck. They get their money back. Because that's no joke, the 3-day right of rescission for condominium docs. So,
Which one to
so
click
the
on?
A is very critical. If you're on the buy side, you don't want to check that until you have everything. If you're on the sell side, you want to make sure it is checked and you give them everything.
The A.
The A. And this one, this is saying that you're acknowledging it, that it's voidable. So you can check this, but you're
Buyer
understanding buy side or sell side because you're understanding that it is voidable. This is the B is simply saying that you're understanding it is voidable. It's an acknowledgement that it is voidable by the 3-day right of rescission by delivering that. Okay. Yeah. Well, it depends on what side you're on, right? Are you buy side or sell side? If I'm on the buy side and haven't got those documents, I'm not checking A, right? I mean, you got to make sure you have them. Okay. Now here, look at this buyer's request for documents. Now, if I'm on the buy side, I'm not checking A. I'm going to say the buyer requests. That's what you see, how many times have you really filled this out right? I guarantee it's not being filled out right. I know that because I look at it all the time. So you got to make sure buyer request. So guaranteed, this is not being, so when you're submitting the offer on a condominium, you need to not check A, check the one that you understand that there's a 3-day right of rescission, and check you're requesting a copy of all those things.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you have received everything, if you're on the sell side, you're going to send back saying you do not request and you've received the documents, and you're going to put the day's date that you're sending it over. You see that? Again, you got to be really careful what side you're on and understanding how to fill this in. Because this document is critical in understanding that 3-day right of rescission. Okay. Also, the common elements, is there parking included, right? Let's make sure we're filling that in. Now, this is also talking about that new thing, guys, the governance form, the milestone inspection, and that structural integrity. This is all right here. So remember, that still does affect us too. So this is very important that they understand about the structural integrity reserve study that's happening. You know, how old is the property? Right? How far is it from the water? Now, again, we're pretty far from the water, so it's probably not affecting us unless you're working by the beach. Okay. And, but definitely also at 3 stories or higher, right? It has to be over a certain height. Okay. But you've got to make sure if they're buying a certain property, a certain age, that they're getting these things done, because if they are, and they haven't had these things done, who's going to be the one in trouble? The buyer, and then you. Okay, they have to be able to show that they're understanding this, because this is here for disclosure purposes, but you've got to make sure you're explaining to them. Right? Is everybody clear about what all this is? Okay, any questions on the condominium rider? Now, one other thing, when you guys are selling a condominium or buying a condominium, seller's disclosure, let's do disclosure. Seller disclosure. Oh, it might be. Let's see, disclosure. But it's for condominium. Seller's property disclosure, residential, condominium. There is a different disclosure for a condominium than for a residential home. And I cannot tell you how many times I see that wrong. Also, you have to get this. You can't say, oh, I didn't live there. I'm not going to supply that. Because again, this is coming from the condominium. This is not the seller. Yeah, it talks about appliances. It talks about wood destroying organisms, but it's gonna, from the condominium, what do you own, guys? Sheetrock in, right? So a lot of these things that they're talking about, what is it? Sheetrock out, right? A lot of these things have all limited common elements, the association. You can't say, I didn't live there, I don't know. You can't just pass this off.
They exit.
You
They exit
can't.
all the-
You can't, you have to give this to the association. First of all, if someone's getting a loan, they'll never get a loan, right, Maria, if they don't have this?
What, I'm sorry. I was
If
talking-
if you're getting a loan, you're not gonna require this to be given to them?
It's the governing document?
No, this is the association. Is there any proposed change to the association governance?
Typically, unless the box is checked,
Uh-huh.
I don't like to see, unless you have check sellers before page 11.
Mhm.
Then I don't require the sellers.
What about FHA? So they're not gonna require this?
I don't think so.
Really?
Unless it's checked, no one is gonna, unless the box is checked on the regular contract. The seller's disclosure box, which a lot of people don't check, they just. I've never had to give the seller's disclosure. And
For
I personally
a
don't like it
CA
because. it's
Condominium?
anti-
For the condominium?
About the.
Condominium.
seller's disclosure.
Yep, for condominium, seller's disclosure condominium. Because it talks about the condominium.
I understand, but is that, if it's not checked on the standard FAR bar in one of the.
Yeah.
That's,
It's not,
if it's not, then we don't.
so you don't ask for it. Okay. Well, I'm still gonna say I would want it, because look, foreign investment, it's as if they're FERPA. I mean, this is stuff that we need to know. I mean,
The lender care about FERPA.
no, but I'm surprised, for us, we need to know that.
Oh.
How many times is a condominium FERPA? A lot.
Mm.
I think more than
But
residential
people are
homes.
open to
FERPA.
diligence on this Anyway, we're asking for the question, we're getting the.
Yeah, well, you're getting all the docs anyway, because you're having all the docs.
document.
But I'm just saying, like, for me, I mean, we are requiring that you get the seller's disclosure, but the seller's disclosure cannot be the residential one. It has to be the condominium one, because it's different. It's not asking about the lawn, because you don't own the lawn. It's asking about the condominium association. Do you have knowledge if there's any effort by an investor group to purchase units in the complex? Why would we need to know that? Because if there's too much investors' ownership, then people won't be able to buy. Yeah, it'll have to be all cash. They're asking questions because we need to understand, if you're gonna buy in there, right? And then suddenly, like, all these investors buy, and you won't be able to sell it. The only way you'll be able to sell is if it's cash. Or it could just turn to rental.
I don't think I've ever even seen the seller's disclosure on the contract.
Oh, yeah, but it's because people do it
Does
wrong.
everybody
They
know that
probably
there's
don't-
two different ones?
They don't do it, they don't, fill up that.
Well, let me tell you what, this would be the first thing you're gonna get sued for if you knew this and you didn't disclose it. I'm gonna tell you that right now, because in the state of Florida, if you know something that will negatively affect the value of a property and you don't disclose it, you will be sued. And I have seen just recently 2 lawsuits regarding seller's disclosures, lack of disclosure knowledge.
Well, if they at least need to fill it out and write, do not know.
Yeah,
I mean,
something.
they can't.
Yeah, and then I'll see all the time the one for the residential instead of the condominium with the
I
condominium.
don't think I've ever seen that.
People don't know what they're doing.
One for land condo, and we actually own the land. And then the common areas held in condo.
No, because that really wouldn't be the same type of information.
More than just regular single family?
That's a great question. There may, I'd have to look at it and see, there might even be more of one for land, actually, because you're really just purchasing the land.
Maybe probably.
Yeah, that might be a good question. See,
think
the
that's
truth
more
is,
same
it's
thing.
by the state of Florida, you're just required to disclose. You're not required to use a specific form. There's no requirement on a form. The state of Florida requires that you disclose any knowledge of information that could potentially negatively affect the value of the property. That's really what the requirement is. And it's on the listing agreement. It's like 2 little lines, which doesn't give you much room. So the seller's disclosures are there to help you jog your memory if you know of things. The thing is that there's a separate one for the association, because there's way more things in an association, because you don't own anything more than the sheetrock in it. But knowing all this stuff could definitely negatively affect the value of that property. Do they plan to propose to materially change the common elements? Do you think that would affect your property all day long, right? Is there any legal action that could potentially affect the association? That would definitely affect the value of the property. So these things really are going to affect the property much more than what's inside your walls.
And
So-
I would suggest particularly if you have a cash buyer, make sure, because if you have a cash buyer, then you don't have a lender checking out the condo.
It's
association.
true.
And then, yes, that's great, I have a cash buyer for this condo and nobody else can
Yeah.
lend in there. Well, what happens when they go to sell it next
Mhm.
year? And they can't sell it because it has to be a cash buyer.
Exactly. I mean, I'm saying to cover yourself.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So anyway, guys, just make sure if you're doing this, that you're using the proper seller's disclosure, because condominium has a condo one. Everybody clear on that? Anybody have any questions on that?
What about on the HOA one?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any cancel thing in that? The three, like, you know, you have to get the condo docs. Is there anything with HOA docs about canceling the?
Yeah,
contract?
you have a 3-day right of rescission for the homeowners association
Same
docs as well.
Okay.
Mm-hmm, you sure do. Yep. All right, so that's the homeowners association. Thank you, right there. And by the way, guys, when we talk about the homeowners association, because we could look at that.
So that could be the same thing. You could cancel at.
Notice?
If they didn't get it.
Yep, homeowners association, and then you
On the
have
Wednesday,
Chris,
even on the Wednesday.
same thing.
If they didn't get it.
It tells you right here, 3-day right of rescission after they receive all the documents. Here, you have to make sure that you're writing the assessments correctly, because you may have, you know, a monthly, you may have a quarterly, you have to make sure you're writing that. But this is where it's really important. This is where you're putting the capital contribution. This is where you're putting any other kind of fees that they may have. If you don't put that there, and then they come to closing and there's like $3,000 capital contribution, that's going to blow your deal up. So you better know if there's any extra fees that they
I
have,
read
transfer fees.
Contracts, there's never.
Yep. I can tell
And
you
does the
how many
listing agent
times
do it, or do you?
the listing agent's supposed to do it, but how many times listing agents are terrible? And I'm gonna tell you, I can tell you so many times I've seen deals blow up at the end because of that. And then you know what happens? Nobody gets paid. That's what happens, because when deals blow up, and then people are really mad at their agents and they use other people after that. And they'll buy somewhere else, but not with you. So it's just a really sad thing to see happen. And make sure you're putting down this contact information for the management company, because again, you're helping them to be able to go talk to them. That's the whole point of that. Okay. So, and again, is it required that you get the association's approval? Sometimes it is, in a very rare case. That I haven't seen that very often. But, you know, it can be possible. All right, everybody good on that one? But yeah, it is definitely a requirement by the that you get the documents, and you have to have all the documents. So you have to get their same thing, deeds and restrictions. They have to know what the covenants and restrictions are, because they could say you can't ever do something that people are not comfortable with, right? And that's why they have that. You have to see the budget. You have to see you have to be able to look and make sure that they're healthy in terms of their finances. I mean, if they're not, that's going to be something that's going to fall on that owner. So these are all the reasons that you have to see all those documents. Okay, mortgage assumption. Oh, wait, seller financing, mortgage assumption. Funny enough, we just did that with Teresa, the mortgage assumption. We're going to take a look at that really quickly, just because we may get more of them. So we'll just open a contract real quickly. Here's as is. Hold on. So if you happen to have a mortgage assumption, okay, and you're in a financing situation, in her case, it was a VA. It could be a VA or FHA. Those are the only two we've seen that would be assumable at this moment in time, unless there's any more that I know about. So what we were talking about, and I don't know what we ended up doing, but my suggestion was under financing, this is where I put the first loan that you would get. And under other, I would put in here, assuming the seller's financing, I'd write down what you were doing. And this is where I'd put the amount that you were.
Have cash and have finance.
Well, if it was cash, that would be the balance to close, right? But in this case, she was going to get a first from the VA, you think? I don't know if it worked out that way, but let's pretend it did. but pretend it did.
Yeah,
Let's say she was gonna get a first from the VA from her own eligibility, and she was gonna assume as a second, the seller's previous, what they had as their financing, right? If that was the case, the financing would be the first, which would be her new VA. And the other, I would write here, assuming seller's financing or VA, whatever you want to write here. And that would be the amount that you were assuming. And then you would have the total purchase price, how much she was putting down, the amount she was writing as her first, the amount that they were assuming, and then of course subtracting it all would be the balance. Does that make sense?
except the assumable is always in the first position.
Oh, it is?
Always.
Interesting.
So she
Okay,
would have to get she
second.
would have had to get in the second.
Interesting to know. Then I am corrected. So financing would be the assumable and then the second. But either way, you'd break up the loan that way. If you were assuming the loan, that would be the financing. And if you were paying the rest, the balance, those would be cash. But was that question? But under here, guys, what you have to do is C right here. You would have to say assumption of existing mortgage. You have to check that. Everybody good with that? And then you have to come back here and you have to do assumption. You see this? Now, again, they have a crisp and a far bar. As usual, you have to pull the assumption of existing mortgage. Now, let's take a look at this because you may be using this more and more or not. But let's take a look so we understand it. And this was actually because you were one of the people who made me think about doing this class, because we're using addendas that we've never used before. So this property is encumbered by an existing mortgage in the amount of, this is the amount that we're going to be assuming, which has whatever type of rate it was it variable, fixed, whatever. And at what percentage, right? That's what you write down. And at the time of the title transfer, some fixed interest rates are subject to increase. So if it shall, what is the percentage it will not increase, exceed? So sometimes they do a wraparound, right? So is it going to exceed? Let's say it was at 3% and we said we'd go no more than 4%. So that's where you'd say won't increase more than up to. The seller shall furnish a statement from the mortgage stating the principal balance, method of payment, interest rate, and status of the mortgage, or authorized buyer or a closing agent to obtain the same. If the buyer has agreed to assume the mortgage, which requires approval by the buyer mortgagee for assumption, then the buyer shall promptly obtain a necessary application and diligently complete and return it to the mortgagee. Any mortgagee charge was not to exceed this amount. So how much would that have been?
I have no idea.
How much is it normally? Oh, you've never done an assumption. So the not 1% of the amount assumed. So it was supposed to be like what, 250 or something like that. So 1% of that would have been like $2,200. So you could have said not to assume $1,000. You could have picked a number here. And then it says, if buyer is not accepted by the mortgagee or the requirements for the assumption are in accordance with the term of the contract of the mortgagee, or it's in excess of this $1,000 or whatever you write in there, the buyer can rescind or the seller can rescind at the contract and nobody has to pay anything and the contract is free and the buyer gets their money back. So because you don't know right until the end what the deal is, that's what this is for. So basically you move forward as if these are the terms. Okay. You currently have a 3, they may go to 3.5. So we're going to cap it at 3.5. And we know you're a fixed interest rate, but we know it may go to 3.5 maximum because the bank's going to charge us a little percentage extra or whatever the case. And we know we'll be willing to pay up to $1,000 in fees. That's the max. But we could get to the closing table and suddenly it's 4% and they want to charge us $2,500. Well, that's not going to work for anybody because that's why we wrote this.
Very best number you can do.
What? I don't know who said that.
And keep in mind, from today forward, every house I'll apply.
I'm sorry.
Who is that? Okay, thank you. So the most important thing, guys, here is that what this does is it caps the risk for the buyer. Okay, so that way the buyer can get out really up to the closing table because that's probably when you're going to find out they're close to what this term is. Does everybody see? So this would work for FHA. This would work for VA. You would use this same addenda no matter which type of assumption you were doing. Everybody clear on that?
The mortgage company did tell the seller that, with the assumption it would take 60 days, so.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so the assumption, thank you, Teresa, would take 60 days in this instance. Was it because it was a VA? Okay, it could be because it was a VA that it was a 60 days to assume it. We don't know. FHA could be the same or shorter. We don't know. Yeah. That's true. Make sure you ask because it could be longer than the 30 days or whatever you had
And
planned to
there is
close.
difficulty getting the second mortgage to fill the gap.
Yeah, well, that's because they're in second position. If they were in first position, it'd be different. Yeah,
But yet the current mortgage holders
well, I imagine, yeah.
are already in first, why would they give up first?
Mm-hmm. It does make sense. I just thought for the VA because it's a veteran.
She was, well,
Well, she wasn't the veteran, but yeah. Yeah, I understand where you're going with that though. Okay, everybody, any questions on the assumption of mortgage? We've never talked about that before because it was never something we ever did, but we're doing them now. So we wanted to talk about that. FHA VA financing, we've already looked at that. I want to look at the appraisal contingency really quick because this addenda did change. And I think there's still some confusion on what it means. So here it is, appraisal contingency. So there was some confusion that people felt like if you took an appraisal contingency and you were representing the seller, that the seller had to change their price. That is definitely not the case. So all the appraisal contingency means, and let's just take a quick look. No, what it means is that the buyer says that they're going to have an appraisal by a licensed appraiser before a certain date, which is at least 10 days prior to closing. But we already know that it has to be within the loan approval period because that's the financing portion anyway, right? And for at least, and you put in the property amount, which is the purchase price, right? If the appraisal comes back at least at that value, the buyer shall or less than the value, the buyer shall deliver a copy of the appraisal to the seller within 3 days after the date. So they have 3 days after that date to deliver notice to the seller. And this is their options. They could either terminate the contract and get their money back, or they can waive the contingency and continue. That is all they can do. If they fail to timely obtain the appraisal, this is already null and void. So that's really all this thing does anymore. It just gives the buyer that option that if it doesn't appraise, they can get their money back. Does that make sense? Because what happens is, I might be in my loan approval period. The house may not appraise, but the lender may not deny me. They may say, well, you have the money to make up the difference. You're not denied the loan. Mm-hmm. That's the difference. So if you have a very strong buyer, let's say they're putting down 70%, 50% rather, right? And the home doesn't appraise, the lender says, no problem. You have plenty of money to make up the difference. We're not going to deny you. That's who needs an appraisal contingency, right? If you have a 90-10 FHA, well, FHA has a VA addendum anyway. They already have that. You don't need an appraisal contingency, right? But the people who need maybe an 80-20 conventional loan, the question that you need to ask the lender is at what price will you, of the appraisal, will you, obviously give them a denial on the loan? That's what you need to know. Because if they're not going to deny the loan because of a low appraisal, your buyer can get stuck having to pay up the difference. And if they're not comfortable with that, that's when you want to use the appraisal contingency because it just gives them the out that they can get their money back. It doesn't say to the seller has to do anything. And that's where sellers get really confused. They feel like, oh, I've heard so many, even my agents ask me, oh, does that mean the seller has to lower the price? Not at all. Seller doesn't have to do anything. The buyer now has a contingency that they can get their money back, but they were within the loan approval period anyway. And many times if the house didn't appraise, oftentimes that meant the buyer might have gotten denied anyway, right? Depending on how good or not good the buyer was. But if it's a very strong buyer, probably they wouldn't have been denied for it. That's the difference. Everybody clear on that? Why you would use it or you wouldn't? I think there was some confusion on that. That kind of loosened up.
Jared,
Yes.
even if it is a cash buyer, the cash buyer may not want to buy if it is below appraisal, right?
True. You have a cash
that pro-
deal, you could
protect
add
the
an
cash
appraisal
buyer.
contingency so that they could get an appraisal because a cash deal wouldn't need an appraisal. And they could still see if it was worth the value and give them a chance to get out. Absolutely. Because they did not have a financing contingency. Absolutely. You're now giving them a contingency they didn't have. Totally true. Good thinking.
Even if it's cash.
Okay, you good with that? That's a good one.
Great.
Okay, I do not, interest-bearing accounts, I don't recommend that. Defective drywall, please, guys, don't use that. We don't have that in our market. It's a silly thing for us to be pulling out, so that's not something we need. Coastal construction, we don't need here. Insulation disclosure, I don't feel that we need either. All right, lead-based paint, we all know how that one works, right? If it's pre-1978, and if it is, then you need to use the pamphlet Living with Lead-Based Paint. Okay, so you gotta use both. Housing for older people, you understand that if it's a 55 plus or 65 plus, depending, that's when you use that addenda. Rezoning, that is something that you would use if you're actually trying to go in for a rezoning, but that's not something we usually use. Lease purchase, lease option, I hate them, so let's not even look at them. I am gonna look at the pre-closing and post-closing occupancy, although I hate them, because you guys still continue to use them. Okay, so here's a pre-closing occupancy. Let's talk about that. Okay. So this one was changed recently. All right, this contract is contingent upon buyer and seller. This, I like the way they changed this, by the way. I still don't like it, but I like the way they changed it. If left blank, 10 days after the effective date, delivering to each other, this is what's changed, guys. Either a mutually agreeable lease, a pre-closing occupancy agreement, which, guys, is this, or a similar agreement, a pre-closing agreement, prepared at either the seller's expense, the buyer's expense, or they split equally, right? For the buyer to take possession of the property on what date? Okay, so you gotta figure out what day is the buyer taking possession. The pre-closing agreement shall provide that the buyer takes possession on paragraph 11, and that property maintenance and property inspection repair are no longer applicable. The buyer thereby accepts the property in its existing condition. That is super important, you understand that. And it relieves the seller of any repair, replacement, treatment, or remedy obligations, except with respect to any items identified by the buyer pursuant to that prior to taking occupancy with regards to repair, replacement, treatment, or remedy. Then the buyer shall have in their sole obligation to maintain the property and shall assume all risk of loss, which would mean what? You better get insurance. The buyer shall pay a monthly rent of, plus applicable sales tax, I don't know why they say that, and payable monthly in advance. If the parties fail to mutually agree within the time period stated above, the buyer has not taken occupancy of the property, then either party by written notice may terminate this contract and the buyer shall be refunded the deposit, thereby giving each other out of the contract, right? So what's the important thing here? So essentially, if you have a buyer who's taking pre-occupancy, they better do a walkthrough as if they're closing on the property prior to taking the moving in. Because now the seller is no longer obligated to repair, replace, or do anything. Their opportunity to say that they're accepting the property is before they move in. Once they move in, they have to maintain that property. It's like they've closed on that property. Okay. Now, the bad news for the seller is they may stop paying rent and now they have somebody they still have to evict. That's why I hate it if we're the seller, right? Because we now have somebody in there that's supposedly paying us monthly. If they stop paying us monthly, we still have the same problem that they could default and then we're stuck with it, a tenant who's no longer paying, so we could evict, right? But the good part about this is it's very clear that if all things work out well, the buyer does the walkthrough prior to moving in, and the seller is completely, it's as if they had the walkthrough and now the buyer's moved in. Everybody good at that? The buyer can't go 2 weeks later and say, oh, I see holes in the walls. You have to maintain this. No, it is now all on the buyer. Clear on that? So I like that part. Now, do you have to give a lease? No, because this one document can constitute, if they're all in agreement, says they have to be agreed with a lease or pre-occupancy closing agreement, which this is, or a similar agreement. So if it's only for a couple months or something like that, this is very simplistic. It also says that the buyer is assuming all risk. So who should have the insurance on the property? The buyer. Now, if I'm the seller, though, would I still probably want to have insurance on it just in case the buyer didn't get it? So what if the buyer stops paying and then the buyer causes a fire and they didn't pay, right? I still own the property because they didn't close. You see what I'm saying? So this is where the gray lies. This is why I hate pre and post occupancy. But in reality, I would say a buyer should get, just like if you moved into an apartment, renter's insurance, right? Because certainly the seller's not paying if you did something in your property and something happened to your belongings, the seller's not paying for any of that. They assume no risk. And it's very clear about that. So that's a good thing. But everybody clear on that? Sure.
I always have people ask, can they put some of those things in before you close, because they have things in pod and they'll give the storage, they don't have to do that for that, is it?
Well, that's not really pre-occupancy because they're really not taking occupancy because they're just putting it in a garage. You need a different agreement on that because are they going to do a walkthrough then? Are they taking, you know what I'm saying? Like,
If they get something stolen out of the garage, I mean, what do they have to do?
nothing. They wouldn't be protected. But I would have an attorney write up something if we were going to do that. But see, again, it gets gray. Because who's to say you wouldn't sue? This is the problem. You could have all the agreements in the world like that. And something happens. Who's going to stop them from suing each other? Nobody. So that's where it all goes to, where. So that's the thing. All right. So here you go. This is the post occupancy. Now, this contract is contingent upon buyer and seller within, if left blank, 10 days. Again, delivering either the lease, this, or a similar agreement. Again, prepared either at seller, buyer, or they split the cost equally. For the seller to remain in possession until, and you either put the date until blank days after closing. The post-closing agreement shall provide that the seller pays a monthly rent of, how much is he paying in advance, and that the seller's maintenance obligation on paragraph 11 shall continue. So they have to continue maintaining the property until after closing, until the possession is delivered to the buyer. However, the seller's repair, replacement, treatment, remedy obligations under paragraph 12 shall not extend beyond closing. So essentially, they're in it, they're still maintaining it, they're still doing everything until they close on it. Once they close on it, they don't have to repair and replace anything, but they have to still maintain it. So that means somewhere has to be a walkthrough, which makes it a little bit vague because here's the problem. The sellers have never moved their stuff out. The buyer really truly never gets to see what's behind the sofa, what's behind the pictures, right? And let's be honest, nail holes aren't covered anyway, scratches, dents aren't covered, but what if they had some big, huge hole behind something like that? Maybe would be covered, right? But you don't get to see that until they actually truly move out. Nothing happens because they don't have to repair or replace. Once you close, this negates their obligation for that. All they have to do is maintain the property. Well, it's maintained the way it was when it closed. It was like that when it closed. That hole had been there the whole time. You never caught it. So this is where it can get gray again. Exactly. This is why I hate pre and post occupancy. Yep. So again, and the other thing is, so you're the buyer, you want to move in your house, but you understand the seller's building, so you're trying to be nice, so you let them stay in there, and they're like, I only need a month or two. Before you know it, that builder didn't close on it, they need 6 months. and the poor buyers end up having to find some place to rent, right? I mean, of course you are, yeah, because that's what happens. That's the reality of post occupancy. It never truly works like you plan it to work, because there's something called life. So this is why I'd much rather say just close and figure something else out, you know? Yeah,
Don't even think about that.
I know, I really hate, well, go get a place to live,
Yeah.
you know, but anyway, I'm not
Well,
gonna.
there are certain situations like probate that could extend the
Um,
expectancy of closing.
I know, but you know what? And I hate to say this, but what if that probate never gets finalized?
I know.
Yeah.
What if the person needs to move in?
Exactly. And now what do? You get a very happy, unhappy person right now. So this is the thing. I'm just gonna tell you that this whole thing is really never very good. I hate them all. Sometimes you do it just cause, but I hate them. So there it is in a nutshell. But those are the documents, and now you know how to use them. I tell you to avoid them, use them very sparingly, but that's it. Let's look at the sale of buyer's property really quickly, because I know a lot of you guys are still using this. And notice that I'm always under Florida Interactive Forms when I'm looking for it. See, I have that highlighted. And I just type in exactly what it says, unless I typed it wrong. Sale of buyer's property, and then it pops up. Isn't that great? Okay. So this contract is contingent on the sale and closing of the buyer's property located, and this is where you put the person's property. Upon entry into the contract of sale, the buyer's property, the buyer shall give the seller a copy of the contract with the third party's identification and purchase price obliterated. The sale of the buyer's property does not close by, you put the date. The buyer has 3 days after to deliver written notice to the seller terminating this contract, in which event the deposit shall be refunded to the buyer, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from all further obligations. Then here you say buyer's property is or is not presently under contract. If the buyer's property is under contract, then of course you provide a copy of the contract with everything taken away. Now, if the contract is not under contract, you have nothing to deliver, right? So this is interesting, because in some instances you may have one of these, and it may go, let's say you have a financing contingency, right? Let's say they do not get approved for the financing, even if because they have a home to sell. This is like a double protection, which is great. But let's say this goes beyond. The financing contingency is ending on the 5th. The closing is supposed to happen on the 10th. They were supposed to close on their home, and it didn't close. And it was supposed to close by the 5th as well. And now the seller will not extend either the financing contingency or the sale of buyer's property. So you have 3 days thereafter to terminate the contract. So you really have 3 extra days to close this. But if that person's property doesn't close 3 days after, they're out of their contingency. They are out of the financing contingency, and they're out of the home to sell contingency. Are we clear on that? So that means that they will not get their deposit back if they cannot close on the 10th. If you ever extend something, because you need to extend the closing date, always extend your financing contingency. Because otherwise, when you can't close because of financing, you don't have a financing contingency, your buyer will lose their money. Keep that in mind. If you have to extend because of a financing situation, you must always extend the financing contingency. If you don't, you have to let the buyers know, listen, they won't extend your financing contingency. You could try to extend your closing, but if you can't close, you will lose your deposit. Are you okay with that? Sometimes buyers are okay with that and they're willing to give it a shot. But they have to be very well aware that their deposit is on the line. And listen, if we could get it away that they don't lose their deposit, fabulous, right? But we always need to be very clear at all times if their deposit is on the line or not, which means we better be very well aware if their deposit is on the line or not. Is everybody clear?
Over what you went over the other day about giving the notice? Because I think people forget about that.
Which part?
Giving the buyer's approval notice to the seller.
Oh, you mean the 33 days that opens the right of approval?
I think people forget about
Yeah.
that, and even if I didn't realize, I thought if I sent it, that would be enough.
Yeah, let's not forget, under the financing contingency, Maria has reminded me, it is very important. If you are representing a buyer, if your loan approval period ends on the 5th, whether or not your buyer has received the loan approval but plans to continue, you must notify the seller in writing. Text messaging does not constitute writing anymore. You must notify them that they have received or not received loan approval and either plan to continue or not. So, and it must have those words. Maria cannot tell them. It must be you. My buyer has received loan approval and plans to continue. My buyer has not received loan approval, but plans to continue. My buyer has not received loan approval. We are canceling, whatever that case is. But you have to use those words. If you do not, look at line right here, 123. By not doing that, what happens is you now give the seller 3 days for which the seller can cancel the contract. So in this instance, if we said the loan approval period was the 5th and it closed on the 10th, that seller now can cancel the contract the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th. And no, we said the 5th, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th. I don't know where those dates came from. And what happens is, oftentimes, guys, you know, because I'm always going for it, we have backup contracts. So if we have a backup contract, it might be better than yours. A lot of times it is, because I get the call, Carrie, how can the seller get out? I get that call all the time. So when I have the call, how can the seller get out? That is usually the answer. If you do not get the written notification by the loan approval period from the buyer's agent or the buyer, which we know is the buyer's agent, saying the buyer has received loan approval or has not received loan approval, it must be those words. Your seller can send a release and cancellation the very next day. Now that buyer will get their money back, but now they're homeless and they're not going to like you very much. Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of that. That is not a good way to go, guys. Does everybody know that part? Everybody clear on that? It's not a fun thing to have to go through. All right. We are at 11:02. We got a lot done. One last thing I want to look at very quickly. I know we're a little over. Is the kick out clause, because I do love the kick out clause. And this is something that I think is still worthwhile to look at. And if you ever worked with a builder, you know a kick out clause, because we did them all the time. So what is a kick-out clause? The seller will have the right to continue to show the property, which we always do, and solicit and enter into a bona fide backup contract, which we can, and third parties that are subject to terminate the primary contract. This is what's different. Upon entering into a backup contract, seller shall give the buyer a copy of the backup contract with the third party's identification and purchase price information obliterated. To continue with the primary contract, buyer must make an additional deposit of blank to the escrow agent within 3 days from the receipt of the backup contract. By giving this additional deposit to the escrow agent within 3 days, the buyer waives all contingency for financing and sale of buyer's property, and the parties will close on the closing date. The additional deposit will be credited to the buyer at closing. If the buyer fails to timely make the additional deposit, the primary contract will be terminated and the buyer will be refunded their deposit. So essentially, you could always take a backup offer. What this does is it now says, when I tell you I have a backup offer, so when I take a backup offer, let's say I have an offer from Linda, and then Claire sends me a backup offer. I don't have to tell Linda I have a backup offer from Claire. I can keep that in my pocket. And then when Linda doesn't send me that you have loan approval, I just send her a release and cancellation. But this is better because Linda's came with a sale of buyer's property. And so when I countered with a kick out clause. So when I get this second offer from Claire, I now send Claire's offer over to Linda. Now Linda's buyer has to put in more money, and the sale of buyer's property is gone, as is their financing contingency. The reason they have to get rid of the financing contingency is more than likely they're not approved financing if they don't sell their house. right? How many people will get financing if they haven't sold their house? That's the problem. That's why the financing contingency is gone. So basically, it says, I want the house so much, I'm willing to risk it all. This is what builders do to be able to purchase their house, so to stay in first position. But if they don't want to do that anymore, they say, forget it, I'm out, and they get their deposit back, and now Claire's is in first position. Now, I might have said, Claire sends her offer, it's not as good as Linda's, so I don't take it. Or I could just take it as a backup offer and not exercise my back kickout clause. You see what I'm saying? There's other things I can do, but I have all the cards, and then I get a backup offer from Karina, and now I'm going to exercise my kickout clause. It's like when you play Uno, when you get the Uno card, it's the ultimate Uno card. Okay, everybody good on that? So the kickout clause is awesome, but you cannot feel bad about waiving the financing contingency, because you can't just get rid of the sale of buyer's property, because you get rid of the sale of buyer's property, but they're not going to probably qualify for unless you're 100% sure that they can still close without selling their home. Then what's the point? Because if they have to sell their home, it didn't matter anyway. Does that make sense? So that's why you got to get rid of that. All right. Well, I think we went over some really good addendas. Did everybody get something good today? I hope. All right. Well, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. Remember, on Tuesday and Wednesday, I'm going to be down in Sarasota for our leadership once a year, building everybody's business for next year. Woo! And I will be back on Thursday to do the difference between as is and far bar and law 264. You know, my absolute favorite. So much fun. So we will go over that on Thursday. So have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Beijo.
Thanks, Carrie.
You.